Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Reason, actualization of self-consciousness, pleasure and necessity. Self-consciousness, which on the whole knows itself to be reality, has its object in its own self, but as an object which initially is merely for self-consciousness and does not as yet possess objective being, which confronts it as a reality other than its own. And self-consciousness, by behaving as a being for self, aims to see itself as another independent being. This primary end is to become aware of itself as an individual in the other self-consciousness, or to make this other into itself. It is certain that this other is in principle already itself, insofar as it has lifted itself out of the ethical substance and the tranquil being of thought to its being for self. It has left behind the law of custom and existence. The knowledge acquired through observation and a theory as a grey shadow which is in the act of passing out of sight, for the latter is rather a knowledge of something whose being for self and actuality are other than those of this self-consciousness. Instead of the heavenly seeming spirit of the universality of knowledge and action in which the feeling and enjoyment of individuality are stilled, there has entered into the spirit of the earth for which true actuality is merely that being which is the actuality of the individual consciousness. It despises intellect and science, the supreme gifts of man. It has given itself to the devil and must perish. It plunges therefore into life and indulges to the full the pure individuality in which it appears. It does not so much make its own happiness as straightway take it and enjoy it. The shadowy existence of science, laws and principles, which alone stand between it and its own reality, vanishes like a lifeless mist which cannot compare with the certainty of its own reality. It takes hold of life much as a ripe fruit is plucked, which readily offers itself to the hand that takes it. Its action is, only in one respect, an action of desire. It does not aim at the destruction of objective being in its entirety, but only at the form of its otherness or its independence, which is a show devoid of essence. For it holds this objectivity to be in principle the same essence as itself, or its selfhood. The element in which desire and its object subsist as mutually indifferent and independent is animate existence. The enjoyment of desire puts an end to this existence so far as it belongs to the object of desire. But here this element which gives to both a separate actuality is rather the category, a being which is essentially in the form of thought. It is therefore the consciousness of independence, let it be natural consciousness or consciousness developed into a system of laws, which preserves the individuals each for himself. This separation is not in itself a fact for self-consciousness, which knows the other as its own selfhood. It attains therefore to the enjoyment of pleasure, to the consciousness of its actualization in a consciousness which appears as independent, or to the vision of the unity of the two independent self-consciousnesses. It attains its end, but only to learn there what the truth of that end is. It comprehends itself as this particular individual who exists for himself, but the realization of this end is itself the setting aside of the latter, for it is not as this particular individual that it becomes an object to itself, but rather as the unity of itself and the other self-consciousness, hence as an individual that is only a moment or a universal. The pleasure enjoyed has indeed the positive significance that self-consciousness has become objective to itself, but equally it has the negative one of having reduced itself to a moment, and since it grasped its realization in the former sense only, its experience is of a contradiction in which the attained reality of its individuality sees itself destroyed by the negative essence confronting it. which is devoid of reality and content, and which yet is the power which destroys it. This essence is nothing else than the notion of what is this individuality in itself is. It is, however, as yet the purest form of self-realizing the spirit, for it is aware of itself as at first only as the abstraction of reason, or is the immediacy of the unity of being for itself and being in itself. Its essence is, therefore, only the abstract category. Nevertheless, it no longer has the form of immediate simple being, as it has for reason in its observational role, where it is abstract being or posited in the form of an alien being. Is thinghood in general. Here in this thinghood there has entered being for self and mediation. It therefore makes its appearance as a circle whose content is the developed pure relation of the simple essentialities. The realization attained by this individuality consists therefore in nothing more than this, namely that it has cast forth this circle of abstraction from its confinement within simple self-consciousness into the element where they are for self-consciousness, in other words, are expanded into an objective existence. The object then, that is for self-consciousness as it takes its pleasure, its essence, is the expansion of those empty essentialities of pure unity, or pure difference, and their relation. Beyond this, the object which the individuality experiences as its essence has no content. It is what is called a necessity. For necessity, fate and the like is just that about which we cannot say what it does, what its specific laws and positive content are, because it is the absolute pure notion itself, viewed as mere being, a relation that is simple and empty, but also irresistible and imperturbable, whose work is merely the nothingness of individuality. It is this fixed relation, because what is related is the pure essentialities or empty abstractions. A unity, difference, and relation are categories, each of which is nothing in and for itself, but only in relation to its opposite, and they cannot therefore be separated from one another. They are related to one another through their notion, for they are pure notions themselves, and this absolute relation and abstract movement constitutes necessity. The merely single individuality, which in the first instance has only the pure notion of reason for its content, instead of having taken the plunge from dead theory into life, has therefore really only plunged into the consciousness of its own lifelessness, and has as its lot only empty and alien necessity, a dead actuality. The transition is made from the form of the one or unit into that of universality, from one absolute abstraction into the other, from the purpose of pure being for self, which has thrown off all community with others, into the sheer opposite, which is thus equally abstract, being in itself. Consequently, the form in which this appears is that the individual has simply perished, and the absolute unyieldingness of individual existence is pulverized on the equally unrelenting but continuous world of actuality. Since it is, as consciousness, the unity of itself and its opposite, this downfall is still for it its goal and realization, and also the contradiction of what was for it essence and what is in itself essence. It experiences the double meaning implicit in what it did, namely, when it took hold of life and possessed it, but in doing so it really laid hold of death. This transition of its living being into a lifeless necessity therefore appears to it as an inversion which is not mediated by anything at all. The mediating agency would have to be that in which both sides would be one, where therefore consciousness recognized one moment in the other, its purpose and action in fate, and its fate in its purpose and action, that is, would recognize its own essence in this necessity, but this unity is for consciousness just pleasure itself, or the simple single feeling, and the transition from the moment of this its purpose into the moment of its true essence is for it a sheer leap into its antithesis. For these moments are not contained and linked together in feeling, but only in the pure self, which is a universal or thought. Consciousness, therefore, through its experience, in which it should have found its truth, has really become a riddle to itself. The consequence of its deeds are for it not the deeds themselves. What befalls it is for it not the experience of what it is in itself. That transition is not a mere alteration of it, of the form, of the same content. The transition is not a mere alteration of the form of the same content and essence, presented now as the content and essence, and again as object or outwardly beheld essence of itself. The abstract necessity, therefore, has the character of the merely negative, uncomprehended power of universality, on which individuality is smashed to pieces. This is as far as the manifestation of this form of self-consciousness goes. The final moment of its existence is the thought of the loss of itself in necessity, or the thought of itself as a being that is absolutely alien to it. However, self-consciousness has in itself survived this loss, for this necessity, or pure universality, is its own essence. This reflection of consciousness into itself, the knowledge that necessity is itself, is a new form of consciousness.